thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invite, and Lori had asked me a couple of times. I think I kept saying no, didn't I? And last time I thought, well, why not? So here I am, and we came up with this idea of, I think Lori, well, we did it through email about what the title should be. And we came up with this concept of a well-kept secret. And I'm looking at that from the perspective that probably no one has read my nomination in maybe 13 years. Oh, thanks, Rich. I appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. Well, please read it if you can. Okay. And please read it, because I just reread it, and I couldn't believe how much information was in there. And so that, it's all these reports and things I've written are great, but so many of them are planning documents, and they end up on someone's shelf or on a website, and no one reads them. But there's, a lot of work went into it, and there was a lot of good information. I spoke with a lot of people, many of whom are here, but there are a lot of new faces also. What I want to do is just go through. I brought the nomination. So it's like this, and I can pass it around. And please don't read it just as it comes to you, but pass it around. But I want to explain what these nominations are and how this document, so the purpose of it was to get the highest concentration of historic buildings, historic being anything 50 years or older, that's for a building, not for people, you're not historic, and that tell the story of the growth and development of a community. That's how historic districts work. And then justifying why it's significant enough to be listed, because not everything that's historic can be listed to the National Register. You can be historic or you can be historically significant. So let's see here. The little mouse, I'll just do enter. Okay, so this is just, a locator map showing, but you all know where Lovettsville is because I presume you live here and you made it to the meeting. But what was so interesting to me when I was approached by David Edwards and then met Ed, I came and met everyone, was I hadn't done anything like this. It was so close to Maryland and it intrigued me. And then the whole German element, I had, there were, we had a lot of Germans that came down into the Shenandoah Valley. And there was, they, especially south of Winchester, which is where I grew up. And, there was still the Germanic element there, but there was a true acculturation with the English. I mean, the English had such a strong influence, many of whom were coming from Tidewater. And what intrigued me here was how there was so much of the German element still here, and how strong it was, and how it, forced the development and affected the development of the community. Okay. So I'm going to follow like how these National Register nominations are written. So you have to talk about, why is this significant? So I'm not going to read to you what's there, but really the architectural resources are truly something in this community. And I drove through here a couple of weeks ago and then again earlier today, and there's still a high degree of historic preservation. A lot of the buildings are still here. I know you've lost some, but generally speaking, you still have a lot. And it again tells the story. It tells the religious history. It tells the domestic history, educational history, and that is really important. And so again, this is one of the few settlements, especially this far north in Virginia, that were created by German immigrants. So that's another thing that's captured in this National Register nominations. And then the other thing was also that it's one of the few communities that was primarily with the Union during the time of the Civil War. And so it has a different kind of history. So again, this adds to its uniqueness, which is discussed in the National Register nomination, talked a little bit about its location, so near the Potomac River crossing, and how it was really more associated with Berlin and, or now Brunswick, especially when the railroad came in, that really created a huge spurt of growth here. So as you know, it's the enclave of these different types of buildings. It's not just domestic buildings, it's all different kinds of buildings. And of course, the churches and the cemeteries, these burial grounds. There's so many burial grounds that are in here. And I will talk a little bit about what I ended up doing, which was unique for a historic district. I know that there have been lots of people who've spoken about the history of Lovettsville, and I'm sure you all know the history of Lovettsville really well, so I'm not going to go into it, but there is, that history is captured in the nomination, and that has to be done. So the history is captured, and then a discussion of how the architecture that reflects that history is still surviving, if that makes any sense. That's how these nominations work. So we have this, early German settlement. The community was known as the German settlement. And, there were other Germanic communities. There was, especially in the Piedmont, there was Germantown, but if you go, which is in Fauquier County now, if you go there now, there's really not much that survives from that. So we had to choose a period of significance, which went back to 1770. That is, when is the earliest resource, physical resource, because this is the National Register of Historic Places, that you can confirm. And we went with 1770, which was the earliest burial. And it goes up to 1961, which was when the post office was built. And it was about 50 years from the time the nomination was written. And then we talk about different significant dates, when it was officially established, when it was reincorporated in 1876, the fire that occurred in 1923, and then the construction of the post office building, which I'm happy to see is still here. It's one of my favorite buildings. And then, it was named for David Lovett, who subdivided the property. And we drew the nomination to be 90 acres with 111 properties. So all those 111 properties are discussed in there. There's the address that's given, they're assigned a number. I took pictures of every one that are all housed in the Department of Historic Resources down in Richmond. And there's a brief description of each of them, and then they're incorporated into a text. So one of the things that we tried to convince people, and I think is always important, you may not remember this, but it's a good documentation to have. If something, heaven forbid, happens to the community, at least you have these photographs and descriptions of what the buildings look like. So at a minimum, that's a good thing. So the earliest buildings are located at the center of town, which makes sense. I'm not including these churches that were far away. But we had mainly dwellings, but other sorts of things, like commercial buildings, 3 churches, these 5 cemeteries, 3 former schools, and I see that one of them is gone up there or has been replaced, but that's okay. Well, I know. That's another presentation. I'm sure someone gave a presentation. So you have vernacular forms, and you have Queen Anne detailing and craftsman style detailing. And remember, I'm an architectural historian, so you're going to learn a little bit about what that means if you don't already. So then hopefully when you walk down the street or drive down the street, you can pick out these elements, and you will be identifying historic buildings before you know it. So, and the other great thing was there's very little modern construction, at least in 2012 and 13 when I was here doing the survey. But as I've seen, you have a lot of new construction, but it's on the edge of town, so that's great. That's the way it should be. It hasn't really negatively affected, I don't think, visually the community. So I don't know if you can see the boundary. It's really wonky, but it follows property lines, and it was carved out to include, again, the highest collection of historic buildings. So I think it's pretty, sorry, this thing, it's my nemesis. Okay, yeah, so we're here. So we went up and included, you know, the African American cemetery, and then again, these buildings, as you leave town, there are 3 of them. We excluded all these. You know, some of them are post-World War II, but mainly, you know, I think a few of them are from the 1950s or 60s, but we didn't include them because they were, you know, after the period of significance ended. And then, of course, here we just carved out the historic buildings. And then what was unusual is this is where New Jerusalem Church is. So the Department of Historic Resources and the Park Service doesn't like to do these non-contiguous district boundaries. It has to be a contiguous area because you can't have, like, we call it the Swiss cheese effect, because a lot of times when you have the public hearings at the end of the projects, people say, well, I don't want to be in it. Take my house out. Remember, we had some people, yeah. And we're like, sorry, we can't. You know, there's a vehicle to do this. It was, if people were against it, they could write letters. And if the majority was against it, it would not go through. So it has to be a contiguous area, hence the sort of crazy looking boundary. But again, we wanted the highest concentration of historic buildings. But I wanted, of course, to include New Jerusalem Church and the 2 cemeteries there because they're so significant and they're so important to the story. So this is only one of 2 historic districts I've ever done where I've been allowed to have a non-contiguous area. And I don't know if they do it, if they let people do it anymore, but I talked my way into it. Anyway. So then there's a discussion about, okay, why is it historically significant again? So to be listed on the National Register, you have to be associated with an important event. It can be like, you know, one event that happened in one day, like a Civil War battle, or it can be a trend, like agriculture. You know, this building tells the story, helps tell the story of agriculture. So that's one area. Another one is if it's associated with an important person in history. The third is if it has architectural significance. And then the fourth are mainly used for archaeological sites. There is if it is a property that's going to yield, has the potential to yield information in the future. So we worked on this and said, Lovettsville is eligible under criterion A, which is the history. And these are the areas: exploration and settlement, that would be with the earliest people who settled here, that's still visible in what survives. Under ethnic, it was the Black history and also the European history of the Germans. Politics and government for what the attitude was here, what it was like here before, during, and after the Civil War, which was a unique story in Virginia. And then also commerce, because that helped, you know, spur the growth of the community. So under criterion A, in that document that's making its way around, there's a discussion of all these themes, and then there's a whole section about the architecture. So just quickly, you know, we talk about, this is the 1876 map of Lovettsville, which had a modified grid plan, which is still identifiable today. Again, that's, you know, does it look like it did historically? Yes. Does it look like it did probably in 1961, which is the end of the period of significance? Yes. And you'll note here up in the right-hand corner, there was the African chapel lot. And the whole Black history is very interesting with Lovettsville. I mean, there were very few slaves or I guess slave owners in the area, relatively few, but we have census records showed the presence of free blacks here. And then, of course, after the Civil War, this was an area where more black families came. So this is the 1891. You can see, can you see Lovettsville? It's in the middle. Forget that that's such a big thing because I'm like, where is Lovettsville? It's just to emphasize how it was at the junction of several major roads and just how close to Maryland it was. And it was, you know, also in the Loudoun Valley between Short Hill and the Catoctin Mountains. So, you know, location, location, location. It was a prime area to develop, and it did. This is a map from 1955. You can see Lovettsville did insert that arrow there. And it shows how little the area changed in the ensuing 55 years since that earlier map. And you can see how Lovettsville is shown in 1955. And all those little dots are buildings. And the one with the little flag on it underneath the name was the school. This is, I had very few historic images to work with back then. I don't know why, but I noticed on your website, and I'm blown away by what the Lovettsville Historical Society has done. I mean, I was looking at it earlier today, and you know, you have a then and now thing going with older images and what it looks like now, which I think is great. And you have a lot of histories that are in there. It's, I think, really incredible. But anyway, this is a circa 1900 view of East Broadway, showing Grubb's Store and Freedom Hall, which is the Masonic Lodge, before the 1923 fire. I don't know why I showed this. This is the nomination, but that's what it looks like. But hopefully after this, maybe you don't have to read it. I'm showing you everything. Okay, I'm just going to give you a chronological tour of the district quickly. So the oldest of the 5 cemeteries was the first German Reformed church. It contains the site of the original church as well as about 450 burials. And here are some of them. I believe that's George Wenner on one side and Elizabeth Wertz on the other. According to the state highway marker that had been erected there in 1988, the church and cemetery is associated with the oldest continuous German Reformed congregation in Virginia, which is pretty huge, which helped elevate this historic district to the state level of significance. Something I failed to mention. You can get listed on the National Register, again, if you show that you know, you're historically significant because of an important event, important person, or the architecture. And then there are levels. You can be at a local level where, you know, yeah, that's very interesting and significant to the local community, but in the larger scheme of things, it's not that significant. The state level of significance is very hard to get because you have to compare it to other similar resources in the state. And that's what we got the listing for. Lovettsville was at the state level of significance. And a few get to be on the national level of significance. I've only done 2 of those. And you know, it's a lot of work because you have to compare it with every other similar resource. Of course, the New Jerusalem Lutheran Church is associated with the Lutherans who organized here in 1765. And this building is later, but that we see here, but the cemetery contains approximately 600 graves. And here are some of them, and you can see these Germanic motifs, especially on the one on the left there. And I think the earliest legible stone is from 1794 and 1796. Yeah, which is what we used for, we knew it was there, but that's what we used as the beginning of our period of significance. So next to the New Jerusalem Church is Union Cemetery, which is a community burial ground for the area. It occupies 16 acres, and it's laid out in a grid pattern. And the entrance is marked by those brick gateposts and that wonderful metal decorative wrought iron arch, which says Lovettsville Union Cemetery Incorporated, 1879. And it contained, I'm sure it's grown, about 3,600 graves, and was incorporated in 1879. Although there are stones there from as early as the 1840s that we identified, and some that came from the New Jerusalem Cemetery. And you know, it's interesting to read about these cemeteries because the trustees who are part of the organization of these cemeteries were some of the old names that you see, you know, and have seen for a long time in Lovettsville. But the close and sort of integrated relationship of those cemeteries was why the Department of Historic Resources and the National Park Service let us have a discontiguous district. It was just that important. And then, of course, there was the African American Methodist Episcopal Church, which is on that triangular lot on the northernmost part of the district. And that was, you know, again, a really unique source. And I guess the African American Methodist Episcopal Church was founded in 1869 by 5 former slaves who had moved here from Orange County. And then there's the Presbyterian Cemetery. I guess that's still behind the town office. And so that was on, there was the Providence Primitive Baptist Church on South Berlin Pike, and it was created in the 1830s. And that's a really picturesque little cemetery. Did I say 1960s? Oh, 1976 I had. Is that right? The Providence Primitive Baptist Church. I thought I'd written the wrong thing. So let's talk a little bit about the dwellings because there's so many of them. So the earliest dwellings in the Lovettsville district are located either on East Pennsylvania Avenue or East Broadway and date to the 1820s. And that makes sense because, you know, you saw that old map that shows the creation. So this is the house at 2 Pennsylvania Avenue, also known as the Potterfield House. And most of the domestic buildings in Lovettsville are frame. Some of the earliest are of log. Brick was used in about 20 resources. There are no resources, except a couple of outbuildings, that are of stone except for 2 outbuildings, which is somewhat unusual. So what's interesting with this is, you know, it's the evolution of a house. Houses change all the time. Whenever anyone buys it, they want to add on or whatever. And here you see that it's the back part that is the log part that's the earliest. And then this is a Victorian edition. So I did have to walk around these properties and get a look. Okay, here is another early log building. Actually, it's framed with brick nogging. So that's another very popular 18th and early 19th century thing. You do frame, like timber frame, like you'd see in a barn, and then you fill the cavities with brick for insulation and to keep animals out.
This is now the Back Street Grooves.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Is it open?
Yeah.
I'll have to go there. Okay. Ice cream. Okay. Okay. Oh, that's good. Well, yeah, now you know what that's called. You can go in there and impress your friends about the brick nogging and say, do you know why that was here? And anyway, and it's also interesting because it features 2 front doors, which is very Germanic. And there's, you know, articles have been written on what's the significance of the 2 doors? Does it have to do with the bad spirits and the good spirits? Does it have to do with, you know, the most obvious thing is, well, there were 2 families maybe living there, but a lot of times you'll have the 2 doors right next to each other, pretty much leading into the same room. And I'm not going to explain that to you now, but you can look it up if you're interested in architectural history, and there's a discussion of it. And I talk about it in a couple of the books that I wrote. But that's a very interesting building. Do I have a date on that building? Yes. Look, who asked that? Oh, you did. We'll have to look it up in the, it should be in the inventory when we get to that. I called it the Wenner House. Winners, losers, I don't know. It was Wenner. Okay, yeah. I like to give names to people usually associated with different, okay. So this is what we called the Willard Hall. Is that what you still refer to it as? Okay, good. And it's a really well-preserved example of the Federal style and one of the oldest and most architecturally sophisticated ones in Lovettsville. And it was built in the early 1820s, and David Lovett had sold the land to Thomas Stevens, and it was named after Dr. Willard, a physician who owned it after 1868. And if I recall, this person who owned the house at the time did not want to be in the district. Right, at the time. Okay, yeah.
It was very far.
Good, great. Well, this is a great building, and Federal style, actually it's really the Federal period, but what is characteristic of Federal style buildings is really here, we see beautifully executed brickwork. You can see it over, we call these jack arches. They're just beautifully done. And the way that the brickwork is laid is very nice. And then of course, this is this segmental arch with the fanlight and this tripartite window, which, you know, if you put a little curve above it, it would be like a Palladian window. And so this was a really, you know, great example of that style. And then you have a service building over here. But symmetry was very important. And that's a whole other thing. I guess symmetry is still important to a lot of people and buildings, but the thing is, it showed a sense of, you know, you knew what you were doing when you built this house, type thing. So several other brick dwellings, you know, I mentioned in the beginning there are several brick dwellings, date to the early years of Lovettsville establishment, and most of these exhibit these Federal style detailings. And, you know, you can lay brickwork in different ways. And when you have really early brick buildings, very often the bricks will be, one will be the head of the brick, the short end will face out, and next to it will be the stretcher. So it's header, stretcher, header, stretcher. And that's called Flemish bond. And it's very time consuming to lay, you can imagine, because you've got to pay attention. Put this one this way, but it creates a very formal front. And very often you see that on Federal style houses, and then you look around to the sides and the back, and they've laid it in what's called 5-course American bond, where you have 5 courses with the side showing, and then 1 course with the end showing. And with that, you don't have to pay as much attention. And you know, it's no different than now with a lot of these modern houses. You have a brick veneer on the front and vinyl siding on the back. And sides, because again, you want to impress people who are coming to see you, that they think, oh, this is really a nice house, it's symmetrical, it's made of brick. But here what's interesting is all of these are laid in 5-course American bond, which again, you know, is typical of the Federal style, but I was surprised that there were none laid in Flemish bond. So several houses that date to the 1830s and 50s that are made of frame also exist in the district, and they're located either on South Loudon or East Broadway. Again, the earliest houses are the closest in. Only a small number of resources date to the period after the Civil War and before the town was officially incorporated in 1876. These are, again, 2 examples, one on East Pennsylvania and the other on East Broadway. And of course, we have New Jerusalem Church, which was constructed in 1868, replacing the earlier church that had burned. And it's of the late Greek revival style. And I was thrilled when I drove by there the other day and saw they put up a highway marker in 2015. So that's really great. And it's right there in front of the church. Tells you everything you want to know about, you know, when the wing was built. The stained glass windows were added in the 1930s. And I think the tower was added in 1903. And then the little wing was completed in 1964. This is Freedom Hall. Again, I'm going chronologically through this. And it was constructed in 1869, but partially destroyed in the 1923 fire and then rebuilt. And according to the historic photos, it had a gable end roof. Now it has that quirky little hipped roof. And the brickwork is very similar to what you find at New Jerusalem Church, suggesting perhaps the same builder. And I think it's still used as a Masonic room.
Yes.
That's great. That's wonderful. And it is, it's really a significant landmark and is one of the few examples in the region of a 19th century hall like that. This this is now a church, or is this a bar?
Now used as a church.
Okay. So that was the former Grubb's store, which you see in the photograph there, which was the oldest commercial building. And it was constructed around 1870, and it was remodeled after the 1923 fire, left only part of the brick walls standing. The second floor was gone. So they put this hipped roof. I guess after the fire, they put hipped roofs on most of the buildings that didn't completely destroyed. But anyway, this was a significant building because it is Grubb's store. Then, of course, the African American Methodist Episcopal Church, which was constructed during the period right after the Civil War and is the district's most significant resource related to African American history in the community. As reflected in the architecture, the town of Lovettsville grew at a brisk pace after it was incorporated in 1876. And of the 111 resources we surveyed, 40% of them were built in that period between 1880 and 1920. So there was a real burst of growth. And most of those are balloon frame construction, which is, you know, where you have the framing members that go all the way up through the second story. So you don't have a heavy timber frame. You don't really have brick nogging anymore. But this building was built around 1880, is now the Lovettsville Historic District and Museum. And I guess it was restored in the 1970s and has been open since that, yeah. And I think the one-story, I have that the one-story side wing originally housed the meat grinder, because this was a butcher shop. Remember that?
This was a retail store.
And then the little,
Yeah, that was the sort of the garage that was right over there.
yeah, but there was the meat grinder there.
There was a slaughterhouse, right?
Yeah,
Old slaughterhouse.
okay. So, and then, oh, this is where you are here. So this is the only contributing 20th century church in the district that is an outstanding example of the ecclesiastical Gothic revival style. Gothic revival being pointy windows, which we see throughout. And it's really, if you look carefully at this building, I mean, there's so many architectural details, the quatrefoils, which are, you know, the four lobe things, and the entrance, well, you see one right above the entrance. And it was just really, it's really a significant church. And again, with this addition that was put on, it was done in a really good way that didn't negatively affect this building. So the 24 or so dwellings in Lovettsville from the last decades of the 19th century, there are a lot of them. And these tended to be fairly simple, but with some Victorian detailing. And you can see the detailing primarily in the porches and in around the gables of house. So this, again, this is you learning architectural history, I house. That is where you have a front door, and then you have one, sometimes two sets of windows on either side, symmetrical, and it would be a center plan. And I houses are just one room deep. And architectural historians since the 70s have been calling them I houses because they were identified in a lot of states that began with the letter I. Is that not fascinating? Anyway, so those are I houses. So I houses can be dressed up all sorts of different ways. It could be a federal style I house, like we saw with the Willard House. Or they can have what they love to use here in Lovettsville, this what we call a center front gable. And center front gables kind of allude, it's a Victorian design element, it kind of alludes to the Gothic revival, which was popular at the time. And you can see some have these gable end returns, see how it turns here and then stops. Others, it's a full pediment, and then here it's kind of halfway again. So this was really a popular form used here. Here are plainer I houses without the center front gables. Again, tend to be one room deep, and they vary in the exterior decorations. Most all of these have these turned spindles on the porch, which are a Victorian era. Now this may look like an I house, but it's not because it's squished. And these are called hall parlor plans. They don't have a center hallway. They have just two rooms. So you walk into the room where there's a stair, and then there will be another room there. And this was also a popular floor plan. It tends to be smaller than the I house. So the Queen Anne style, there are several great examples here, and these are at 45 East Broadway, 4 South Loudon, and 9 South Loudon. And what characterizes Queen Anne style is you have complex roof lines. You can sort of see that here. You have different types of siding that are used together. It's sort of busy and not symmetrical anymore. That's not important. And then these projecting two-story bays are very popular. So you have a great collection of Queen Anne style here. So early 20th century, the area continued to grow. I was really so keen on this school that was here when I surveyed it, and it dated, I think the original section dated to 1927. And there was I'm trying to think what that building was used for, and it's still there. The wood shop, maybe, or for agriculture or whatever. Yeah. But anyway, I drove in there before I came here, and even though it was demolished, I think, that was a good, it's not bad. And there were so many people there. And that's wonderful. You're getting people. There was the Reston Bike Club there, and there were all these people swimming and playing tennis and basketball. And I think that's great because it gets people into your community who come, spend money, hopefully, and go away. Isn't that's what we always say in Clark County. Good, come, but go away, go home. This is the former improved order of the Red Man's Lodge at 15 East Broadway, which now I think is Storage Solutions. And this is, the Red Man's Lodge is the oldest fraternal organization in the United States. It was established in the 1830s. And it was solely for white men until 1974. So no red men were probably allowed in there, even though it was called that. But this was used as a theater, a dance hall, a meeting hall, and a community center. But it's great. It's still here and being used. So the residential architecture from the first decades of the early 20th century, is more elaborate than other times. And a lot of that is because there were pattern books available. So you could flip through and you could say, oh, I really like this trim, and you order it, it comes prefab. And because of Lovettsville's location, even though there wasn't a railroad that came through, it was still easily accessible to wider markets. So you could get these, trim work and whatever that looked more to national styles than just, a local builder building something here. And I mean, there are so many of these types of buildings that I'll show you. But the exception of those elaborate buildings from the early 20th century are these three buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. And they're 1.5-story, gable roof buildings. There's minimal amount of decoration. But again, there are these amazing buildings all throughout Lovettsville that are these eye houses with center front gables, some with these projecting windows, bay windows. And then, of course, here you have, it's the next one, yeah. You have, they're in such good original condition. I mean, these turn spindles here, you have sawn brackets, that was very popular. You can order these, and they would come, and then your carpenter would just put them up, and they'd be great. And then this one at 30 East Broad Street, I just love, because you have, this brick house, it's Federal style house, then you have this magnificent, again, this steeply pitched roof line alludes to the Gothic revival, which was popular at the time. And then you have, sawtooth wood up in the gable end, but then you have, regular siding on the other parts. You have a projecting gable. It's a wonderful example of a Queen Anne style that was added on to an older building. And this is the parsonage at St. James United Church of Christ at 8 East Broadway. And it was built around 1913. Great example of the Queen Anne style. And here you have those tripartite Palladian style windows, which are very classical. And you start seeing those. I love this house. I was so happy to see it's still there. And it looks to be in fairly good condition. Is the owner here? No. And it's really the largest and most architecturally sophisticated building in the Lovettsville Historic District. It was constructed in 1918, and I was able to find it in a pattern book. The house is based on design number 60 in the Radford Architectural Company book. And according to a book of their plans published in 1909, the house would cost about $4,000 to complete, and the plans and specifications cost $12. So this is a big deal, I think.
People call it Sears
Radford, yeah. Sears and Roebuck is the most commonly known, but they have Aladdin is another. And you can look these up on the internet if you're interested, because there are a lot of, I think, pattern book houses here. So the colonial revival style was another popular style, not as popular as the Queen Anne here, but it looked to colonial and classical buildings for inspiration. And it, again, was not frequently used in Lovettsville. People loved their Queen Anne style here. But I think the building, one of these buildings, I think it might be the yellow one, I was looking on your website, and it's the teacherage.
Oh, yes. I guess it
I don't know. Time to update the historic district. So by 1920s, houses had gone from the big Victorian thing to, it costs a lot to heat these, back down to smaller ones. And this was a national phenomenon, and it's reflected in the architecture in Lovettsville of the 19 teens and 20s. using the Craftsman bungalow, which emphasizes horizontality and was generally 1 or 1.5 stories in height. And this was a popular trend. You see some from the 1930s. You have some with stucco, some with, just regular siding, but they tend to be low-slung type of houses. These 3 on South Loudon Street are of brick construction, and 2 of them are almost identical in design. So again, pattern book time. And this frame bungalow, one's at 43 and the other is 41, are well-preserved examples along Broadway that are almost close to each other. Another architectural form, and again, I expect you all to identify these as you drive home or drive through other communities, because it's not just in Lovettsville. But a popular architectural form from the early 20th century is called the American Foursquare. And they tend to be cube-shaped buildings, 2.5 stories, meaning there's a dormer up there, and there are 4 rooms on the first floor. You might even live in one or grew up in one. And that was a really popular architectural style. And some of them have Victorian porches, and some have craftsman porches, like this brick one, is a craftsman porch. This is like a colonial revival porch because it's a column. And then this is more of a Victorian turn thing. So you could dress them up however you wanted to, but American Foursquares, you have that here. So in the growth spurt in Lovettsville started to wane really in the 1930s and 40s, but then it had a little spurt again in the 1950s, and by 1960, most of the lots had been built out of the original thing. And some of these architectural styles, again, craftsman, bungalow, you start getting a Tudor revival. But what's a popular style, especially after World War II, are these what we call minimal traditional. It's before the ranch house takes off. It's like a mini ranch house. And they're typical of the post-World War II era. So there are a few commercial buildings in the district that date to this era. I guess the building at 16 South Loudon Street was originally a gas station, although it's now a residence. And it's the only one constructed in the district of rusticated concrete block. It looks like stone, but actually there were these little molds you had, and you just pour them and you could get it a smooth finish, or like it looks like cut stone. So I was really excited about that building. Oh, no, this building I see is for sale, which was a unique commercial building, and it was known as the Loudon Street Mini Mart and Deli. I used to get lunch sometimes there when I was surveying this, and it's a Quonset hut, and it was erected on this site around 1950, and it rests on a poured concrete foundation. And these types of buildings were developed during World War II by the New York construction firm of George A. Fuller. And they were prefab buildings designed to be shipped all over the world by the US military. And after the war, many were sold as surplus, which was the case here, and they would be adapted to other uses. So you see these from time to time in different places, and that's their origin. So Lovettsville even has one of those, which is exciting. And then, of course, the former Lovettsville Post Office, which is now the STEM Discovery Center. And I just loved this building because it speaks of the international style, which is, who would have thought international style would you find like in Chicago and New York City and whatever. But here it's manifested in Lovettsville's post office. And I just thought it was great. And there was some use of structural glass. And then we have the, across the street, the concrete block, the brick Verizon building, which is still the Verizon building, and is a surprisingly elegant, building of the colonial revival style, I think, for a communication facility. It could be a lot worse. And then these are just views. I thought I'd end with just, and you know, granted, I took these in 2012 and 13, but you still recognize it as Lovettsville. So I think you all have done a really great job. And you were listed on the National Register officially June 21st, 2012. So I'm happy to answer any questions about historic districts or where you can go next if you want to do other things or whatever. And then I brought some things, and I did this driving tour of Clark County, which, you know, is just over the mountain. So you may have copies of these if you like. There are like 9 different driving tours in here and a map, and it's hard to find a map of Clark County. And then I brought some of my books that I've written. If you're interested in those, just let me know. So, thank you.
We'll do Q&A in a minute. Before we do that, you wouldn't know, but we passed the hat. We passed the hat. We do not.
You don't have to pay you?
You don't have to.
Oh, I don't know.
You don't have to. So we don't sell tickets to these events. These are not ticketed events. We don't do that. But this is to defray the expenses of the
That's
license.
why you have it in a church.
Yeah, it comes naturally to people. Okay, we can go ahead with questions. You can call it, please.
Unless I missed it, I don't think you mentioned it last time, so which house was it?
I don't think I did.
Long house, it's like, second part of the question, do you know if it's the oldest house or is it new?
I don't think it is the oldest house. Now, this actually is a very good question, because when I did the National Register nomination, you're not supposed to, well, you can't because you don't have the time, to do the history of absolutely every building. First of all, I didn't go inside any of these buildings. So I'm looking at these buildings from the exterior and then trying to back them up with readily available historical information. I mean, I did spend some time at the courthouse, obviously looking at deeds and wills. But so I did not specifically research the history of that house. So I do not know if it's the earliest. And, you know, deed research can sometimes tell you that. The thing is, if it was built before 1820, it's very often difficult to tell because deeds, you know, they have this canned language of any buildings or appurtenances or whatever on a property. And in Virginia, it was only after 1820, if you look at land tax records, that buildings were broken out as being built there. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Which house are you talking about?
Next door.
Is it Love
I said
House?
next door.
Love House, I'm
If that's the oldest one.
asking if it's the oldest house.
I can go look at it afterward. Do you live there? Do you live there? No, you,
It's several times, and it's square long, you see the edge and everything, it's very, very old.
yeah. Well, if it's log, it's probably one of the oldest.
His house is also his general store, I think maybe a post office, briefly, I don't know. But anyhow, he's the guy that found the town, he's the guy that
Right.
did the plat, he's, this area.
And that's who that's who the town is named for.
People say, no, the Leonard House is old, that doesn't make sense.
No,
Doesn't make sense to me at all.
Well,
Probably.
I'm sorry, Lovett, as far as I know, didn't live here.
What's that?
David Lovett did not live here.
He didn't live in his house.
He didn't live in Lovettsville.
Okay, I have that information.
where did he live?
Down in
Waterford?
around the Hamilton, Percival area, Goose Creek.
Interesting.
Yeah, they named the town after someone who didn't live here. Because he owned it, he laid it out.
And sold the
He was
lots.
essentially a land spec.
Well, it sounds to me like this would be a really good research
This would be, yeah.
project for, you know, the Lovettsville
Right,
Historical Society to do. It would be easy to find out if he lived there, because you would do the deed research, and then you'd look at the census and see where is he enumerated. Is he enumerated in this area? But
We'll talk afterwards.
Yes,
Can you give me a ballpark number in Virginia, how many historic districts at the local level, at the state level, and
Oh,
at the national
God.
level?
I have no idea. Probably, I think there are something like, and I'm sure AI would have the answer to this, but I think that there are like 1,200 historic districts. I think most are at the local level, frankly. Most are at the local level. So I would say probably 70% at the local level, 75% or even more. So Lovettsville was, I remember having this discussion, long discussions with the Department of Historic Resources about it, and they're like, if you can defend it, and so we're able to do that. And then the National Park Service looks over them very carefully too.
And anything graduates is at the national level in Virginia? Or
Maybe like Jamestown, Waterford, yeah. It's a National Historic Landmark. Yeah. Waterford, yeah. And then also, I'm trying to think of, Williamsburg, And then you can have, like, where there are large cities, you can have multiple districts. Like you can have a business district, like Richmond probably has 25 historic districts within it, capturing, again, the resources that tell the story of that growth and development, so. Yes?
In the years you've been doing this, have you noticed a shift in what we're able to consider historic? I ask that because my previous town was Percival, which also was one of these, and no one thought that anything in Percival was historic. And until about the time of the bicentennial, I'm sure that pretty much everybody in Lovettsville felt the same way. Is there evolution in what we consider historic over the last 50
Are you
years?
talking about the citizens, or are you talking about, like, the officials who do?
Both.
Okay. Well, I think, the low-hanging fruit in Virginia has been plucked as far as individual nominations, historic districts, the really obvious ones. So in that sense, I say, there is more openness on the part of the Department of Historic Resources to include more districts. Also, time has shifted, this 50-year thing. I mean, right now we're talking 1975 as the end of a period of significance. If you can justify why it should go to that, like if a town has continued to develop through 1975 in a meaningful way, and you've got resources from that period, you could have buildings from the 1970s, and that gives people, ranch houses give people heartburn when it comes to like historic. I ran into that in Charlottesville about 20 years ago. But I think with local people, you always find, people who've lived here a long time and lived in a community a long time, they're like, this, so what? This isn't that historic. It's very often outsiders who come in and are just in awe and, sort of start raising that awareness. So much of it comes through education. And I think to really appreciate a community, you have to understand its history so that because we drive through these communities and we don't really take notice. And that was my hope. And I try to write these National Register nominations so people get excited about what they see and they can relate them to some aspect of history. So I think that we've always had a hard time with educating, and I can count probably on one hand where communities have been so excited about, everyone's on board for doing a historic district. Now, part of it is, and this happened in Lovettsville, oh no, I don't want you to tell me what to do. I don't want government involvement. And, unfortunately, historic districts, National Register and state historic districts use the term historic district, which is what a local historic district also uses. So people are confused. We had several people who thought that, this meant that they couldn't paint their house a certain color, change their windows, change their roof, and we had to, and you have to explain over and over and over, and they're all, people don't trust government, and that is getting worse, I've noticed. And so you can say something, but they don't believe you. And my experience now, because most of the historic districts that I've done, very few of them have turned into local historic districts, which would be the biggest fear people have. And that has to come from the community itself, who say, enough already, we want to have some control. And what I'm recommending now to communities is sort of a historic district light, or decaf, as I don't know. And, you can, and I did work in Charlottesville, and we used that. They're conservation districts. Give them a different name, first of all. And they're only concerned with demolition and new construction. They're not concerned with color, they're not concerned with, if you want to change your windows or you want to put vinyl siding, that's okay, we won't address those minutiae. But we're concerned about, significant buildings being demolished, and then what's going to go in their place? Is it going to, the design guidelines there would all have to do with scale and setback and things like that, not so much with detailing. So that's been, actually, we're trying to do that in Clark County also. And it seems like that is a easier pill to swallow for people, because they want to protect their neighborhood, but then they don't want to be told what to do. So this is a good, a good balance. And I don't know, you all don't have a local historic district, so it's been 13 years. And, fortunately, things have remained. But if you had a local historic district, like, what if that, house down the road that I was going on about, the $4,000 house to build? The Radford, yeah. What if they wanted to, because that's in the district, they wanted to demolish that, it would be nice if there was some sort of review. I don't know. Anyway, maybe I'm overstepping my.
No, when we did this, when people didn't want to become, excuse me, my friends in Waterford, but they didn't want to become Waterford. When people would tell them what color you can paint your front door, what you can do with your roof, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to really stress that we were not doing a zoning overlay. We were not going to put that restriction on. It never would have gone through if there had been any restrictions.
Right.
So, moral, it's basically moral suasion and symbolic.
Well, and the thing is, people forget, and I wanted to ask you all, how many people have taken advantage of the rehabilitation tax credits? Anyone? Well, because that's one of the huge advantages of being listed in the National Register. You can get 20% state income tax, federal income tax credit. So we're talking a credit, not a deduction. If you rehabilitate your building, if it's used for commercial use. And then in addition, there's a 25% state income tax credit. So you could, basically, if you had a commercial building and you wanted to rehab it to continue to use as a commercial building, that's 45% of the money that you put in, you get back as tax credits. And that is the driving force behind listing of historic districts all across the nation. Because to be eligible for these tax credits, you have to be listed on the National Register. And if you're in a historic district that's listed and you are a contributing building, you are listed for all intents and purposes. And now to take advantage of the tax credits, you have to follow certain rules. Like, they're not gonna give you tax credits for ripping out your windows, gutting your building, and changing the roof line or whatever. You have to repair rather than replace. You have to be sensitive to maintaining the character defining features. But I've done probably 60 historic rehabilitation tax credits for people, ranging anywhere from the George Washington Hotel in Winchester, which is a big, big project, to people who wanted to rehab their house and redo their kitchen, bathroom, and put in central air conditioning. And they got tax credits on that. So, that's a good marketing thing, and I'm surprised people haven't used that. You should. If you have an old house and you're thinking that, oh, it needs some work, how can I afford it, and I want to do the right thing, look into rehabilitation tax credits. It's on the Department of Historic Resources website. And, just like with any government thing, you've got forms to fill out, but I mean, really, the payback is worthwhile. And it's a way to encourage people to preserve their houses within a historic district. Purely voluntary, so you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But that's a good stepping stone then to think about, local historic districts. And again, I think, looking at maybe something that's a conservation district that identifies what is it like if someone came in here and bought 20 of the buildings in town, what is your greatest fear and what can you do to sort of, preserve that? And usually it's demolition and, to be reviewed and what would go back in its place. So, yes.
What other Western Loudon locations are on the National Historic?
Oh, gosh. Lori will know, yeah. Yeah.
Hillsborough?
Yes, Hillsborough is. Waterford, and that's probably the first one that was, Lincoln is. What isn't, we should be asking. There are rural historic districts. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Movement toward making these protected areas.
Yes, I did Panyon Springs back in, I want to say 2009. And again, and I think with that one, it was a sort of, there was one building that was threatened and they were concerned. And a lot of times it's just about having the local people understand their community better. Because again, it goes back, to this appreciating what you have. And if you don't know what you have, it's hard to appreciate it.
It just seems to me that if we're going to push the economic button on this, that many National Register historic districts in one county or 300 square mile section of a county is a huge thing to push because the aesthetic that implies is enormous. And you hardly ever hear Loudoun County do that. We do point out, say, Leesburg and Waterford, but all these other ones allow that atmosphere, shall we say, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, and it's very important. When I was doing work in Fauquier County, they hired me to list 16 of the little villages and communities. And, ranging from Remington to, there are a lot of Paris, Delaplane. A lot of them were just even little hamlets. But the idea was, Rectortown, I think of them all. But the idea again was, let's get people to understand their history. And then, no local districts or anything in any of those, except Paris, I think, had one first, and the Plains did too. They had a local district before they had a National Register district, which I never understood because when you have a local district, there's no tax credits that are available and you have to follow certain rules. So, they should have done it the other way around. But anyway, but yeah, that's a really good marketing tool. But I think Loudoun does a great job with, their historic resources and, there's so much activity. And look here, all of you here today. I think that don't take that for granted, because in Clark County, you wouldn't have that many people showing up. And I mean, I don't know what it is. It's, and maybe it's because there aren't a lot of these small communities. It's more rural. But I think, you know, you all do a great job. I think you really do. So kudos to you.
How long, and you may have said this at the beginning, but how long did it take for this whole process to
It took about a year, I think. A year and
He got off the ground in spring of 2010.
yeah.
So he finished.
And I like to do my architectural surveys when there are no leaves on the trees to take my pictures, because old houses have old trees around them and you can't see them. And you know, you get more bang for your buck, if you will, because I'm, you know, taking them from, trying to stay on the public right of way. So, you know, I had to do the architectural survey first, and then I had to make sense of it, analyze it, figure out what was going on, and then, you know, the forms had to be entered into a database by the state, the photos had to be labeled a certain way. So it was, the architectural survey is one thing, and a lot of communities do that first, and then they wait and then do the National Register nomination, and this was really both at the same time. So, yeah, it took about a year and a half. Two? Yeah. Yes.
So in your survey, was communicating with the property owners and getting on the property or getting in the building part of it?
No.
You did everything from the
I mean,
street?
I didn't hide what I was doing. I mean, I'm walking the streets with a camera and a clipboard. And, you know, when I would see people, I liked talking to people, and I would explain what I was doing. And I think I had a letter explaining what I was doing. And pretty much, you know, the nice thing is you could see the backs of a lot of the buildings by going on other streets. So I try to get as many pictures. But people were very friendly. It was, you know, it was only at the last meeting where there was some
There was
contention.
And you got some pushback because you sent a letter saying you were only gonna do photographs from the street, and
Yeah.
you weren't gonna get photographs of the backs of the buildings because you didn't want to go on the property.
Yeah.
Remember
Did
that?
did I go on someone's property?
I don't know what triggered it, but some reason.
Yeah, I didn't go on anyone's
You weren't gonna
property.
go on the property.
No. There was the day where I used to go on everyone's property. Especially when my first jobs, I would do rural architectural surveys, you know, like in the middle of nowhere, showing up at a farm or whatever. But yeah, now DHR says do everything from the public right of way.
You have a lot of contributing to secondary buildings that's contributing or not.
Yeah. And you know, this was the day before, I think this was the time before you couldn't do Google Maps, and you know, now I know a lot of people in my field, they rely a lot on those. I mean, I'll see their work and I'll be like, oh, why didn't you get a picture? Oh, well, you know, couldn't see it, so we just do a Google. And, you know, there's the shadow of the Google car. I mean, I like to see it, and I like to survey them all, because that's when I pick up on little things like, oh, wait a minute, I saw that detail at this house, and it just makes, I think, for a better nominations. I did it the old-fashioned way. So I guess I could now get a drone and just sit in my car and. Yeah, no, that's good too. Anyway, I don't even know if that's legal. Yes.
When Lovett divided his property into 111 parcels to sell, do you know how many he actually sold? And is there a record of who he sold them to? Can you tell if they were German?
Well, his properties were not all in what's the historic district.
It was
I think they're
outside the area.
It didn't go, it was mainly, what he divided up was the south side of Broadway. Not the north, not the other side, south, east, west, it runs on an angle. But this side of Broadway, and a little ways down South Loudon, but not far down there. So it was mainly the properties along Broadway and what we now call Pennsylvania. So it was not, there was not 111 involved in that. And yes, those are all documented. There's deeds for all of those.
Do you have information at the Historical Society about that?
Yeah, actually,
Yeah,
they do.
I thought they did.
I want to say one thing about the county, you're praising the county.
Oh.
That this distinction between the state and national districts, right, and the local. Loudoun County does not officially recognize this as a historic district. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but the pamphlet that's been put out, the brochure, and the website list, I think, used to be 6, it's probably a few more now, but since this is not a local, doesn't have a local zoning overlay,
They don't count.
this isn't considered, they don't promote it as a historic district.
Well, they should, because you can do the tax credits, and you can also put your if you really want to preserve it, you put it in historic preservation easement. And that's the other, I didn't talk about. If you're in a National Register Historic District, you could do that, and there's a value that's placed on your property, like you giving up the right for someone in the future, like let's say the Wenner house behind us, you know, to put, like, the deed says you could not put vinyl siding over the brick, you could not put an asphalt shingle roof. On the interior, you couldn't, like, strip out the woodwork or whatever. There's a value for that, just like with, you know, scenic easements, and you get a tax credit for that. So there are these, you know, tools that are available, and, you know, financial tools for people that should be known, and the, you know, county should be promoting that, because
What's on their website is the local historic districts that are covered by the historic.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, they are only focused on the local designations.
Right. And we're not on it.
but you're not a local.
I know, but we're a national state.
But they should, you know, they should have another, like a map that would show these other areas, that would include all the rural historic
That's what I
districts.
mean.
Yes, no, I understand what you're saying, and also, you know, the towns promote their own historic districts if there is.
County doesn't track anything inside town boundaries in terms of zoning, historic districts, environmental. You look at the maps, it's blank inside the town. So that's town responsibility.
Right, but it is a bit, it is misleading. The county puts out a brochure on historic districts, and we're not part of it because we're only national and state. And that's, as you
Probably-
pointed out, there's a confusion.
Yeah, it is. The Department of Historic Resources probably has a map of all the, you could ask them to send you a map of all the historic districts in Loudoun County and their boundaries. So they would include, like, the Catoctin Rural Historic District, all the rural historic districts. But it would be good to have that somewhere. I mean, the planning.
The brochure has the purpose of attracting visitors from within or outside.
Yeah,
So why not just everything that those people would use?
that's
In
true.
the brochure.
That's
There are
true.
other purposes, of course, but, you know,
Yeah. We think, well, there's too much information, but a lot of times we leave things out. Yes?
Okay, hi, I'm Jay Harrison, I'm former Executive Director of Historic Fredericksburg Foundation, and the points that was made about educating the populace about the incentives that you spoke of is a problem that's been inherent in our long-time historic district. I live in the historic district in Fredericksburg, and it's about getting information out to the public, because a lot of people are confused about tax credits. They're worried about their rights, their access to credits, how to use them, or they feel they're going to be overwhelmed by the paperwork.
I
And
know,
there are
that's-
a lot of misconceptions by people gossiping in the wrong way
Yeah.
and telling stories, and they're not, the city and the historic district, I mean, the Historic Fredericksburg Foundation at times, and not being really clear to the public. And also, during my time, we were really adamant about working with realtors, about conveying proper information to potential home buyers, and they did a lousy job.
I know.
And you have to stay on top of that. And if you don't do it, people are confused, local, state, and national district.
They do.
You know, I just encountered that a lot. It was very frustrating.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've spoken to a couple of realtor groups, like, you know, breakfast meetings or whatever, to explain to them the tax credits. Because I said, you know, if you're listing a house that's in a historic district, you should be telling the person about the tax credits, because that sometimes will make the difference. Like, they see this old house and they think, oh my gosh, you know. But if you throw in the, you know, 20% state income tax credit, then maybe the numbers will work out. And like in Clark County and in Winchester, and I don't know if they have it in parts of Loudoun County, but there's I'm sure they have it in Fredericksburg. If you do rehabilitation of a historic building according to certain standards, they'll freeze your real estate tax for 10 years. So that can be huge, especially if you buy sort of a dump that's, you know, I had this one client, his building was zero, valued at zero. And, you know, he put $1 million in it, but he didn't have, his tax bill was for zero, except for the land, you know, for 10 years. Then the 10 years passed. But anyway, good news and bad news.
I should say that the town now is very interested in this. And we're working closely with the town on historic preservation, promoting the historic knowledge about the town. The event in September with the Civil War trails, I mean, if you read what Rich wrote about that, the historic district is all over it because it does map onto the historic district. And the town is pushing it at this point, which has not happened in the past. And that will include getting signage. I mean, this has been one, you know, sore thing for me for a long time is we don't have any signs that say entering Lovettsville Historic District. There is interest in doing that now on the part of the town, so that will increase the
Do you have a
knowledge.
walking tour?
No.
You should have a walking
Short
tour.
answer is
I
no.
mean, that would be easy.
We have done that in the past.
Well,
Oh,
this is not a formal walking tour, but we now have a brochure which takes you to 3 chronological Civil War trail signs as a vehicle to get you to look at the historic district, because you have to circumnavigate the district. And that's what we're talking about next month's program, and why we're dedicating the signs. The signs are chronological. They walk you through the major part of the historic district. And when you put historical events on top of the historic district, all of a sudden the picture emerges. And suddenly people realize the value. And that's one of the things I think in our lifetimes, we've seen that start to come. I was not surprised to hear when I arrived in Loudoun 50 years ago about the huge battle to let people know that downtown Leesburg was historic. I was stunned that nobody personally found anything there was historic. And look at us now, and we're just beginning to see it. Part of this is, if you walk around downtown, my wife is looking for a cat. No, that's not her lost cat. You see advertised on the museum. She's helping. And she said she came home yesterday. She's looking at the backs everywhere, looking for a cat hanging around. What an amazing set of contributing structures to the historic district. You mentioned that. These other buildings of various types. You start looking at this. What a great place to walk around with an ice cream cup, or after dinner, or after breakfast. And all of this.
Yeah, from a public right of
What a
way.
great place to do it. And that's what begins to make us appreciate.
No,
We
I
might not
agree.
have before.
So I'm glad to see you're doing a historic district, and you know, and that it's including things not just about the Civil War, you know. It sort of builds on that, not to diss the Civil War, but, you know, there's so much interesting, you know, from an architectural perspective, or from significant people, or, you know, commercial things. You could have multiple historic district, I mean, multiple walking tours, so. Okay. Is that it? Thank you all. Your attention.